He never told me that.
He told no one. That appears to have been entirely deliberate.
She didn't cry at the funeral. She didn't make a scene at the reading of the will. When her stepmother suggested, only days after burying her husband, that Eleanor should start looking for her own place to live, Eleanor said nothing at all. She simply nodded, thanked her for the thought, and went back to work. For 15 years, Eleanor Whitfield had been taught exactly what her place in that family was. Not quite a daughter, not quite a guest, something in between that nobody had ever bothered to name. She had learned, a long time ago, that there was no value in arguing with people who had already decided who you were. So she stopped arguing. She simply watched. And she waited. What none of them understood, not Vivian, not Bradley, not Caroline, was that Harrison Whitfield had spent the last 6 years of his life quietly teaching Eleanor something none of his other children had ever shown any interest in learning. And by the time his will was finally read, that quiet, overlooked decision would cost his second wife and her children absolutely everything they believed already belonged to them. Stay with me, because this story isn't really about money. It's about what happens when cruelty meets a woman who was paying far closer attention than anyone realized. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand what happened at that will reading, you have to go back to where this family actually began. Harrison Whitfield built his fortune the unglamorous way, not through speculation or luck, but through decades of patient work restoring and preserving historic properties across the Northeast. Buildings other developers wanted to tear down, Harrison wanted to save. He had an eye for value that other people overlooked, and a willingness to wait years for that value to mature. It was, in many ways, exactly how he approached people too. His first wife, Eleanor's mother, was a quiet schoolteacher named Susan, who died of cancer when Eleanor was 11. Eleanor remembered very little of those final months with real clarity, mostly fragments. Her mother's hand, the particular quiet of a hospital room in the evening. Her father sitting in a chair by the window, not crying, simply present, the way he was always present for the people he loved, without ever needing to announce it. Harrison grieved quietly and raised his daughter the same way he restored buildings, with patience, with attention, without rushing toward anything that wasn't ready yet. For 3 years, it was just the two of them. Saturday pancakes, long, wandering drives past old properties he was considering for acquisition, where he would point out architectural details to a daughter who was, at first, far too young to understand any of it, but who loved listening to him talk anyway. 3 years after Susan's death, Harrison remarried. Vivian Calloway was elegant, socially ambitious, recently divorced, and arrived in the marriage already raising 2 children of her own, Bradley, who was 13, and Caroline, who was 11, only a year older than Eleanor. From the outside, the new family looked seamless. Photographs at the holidays. A beautiful blended household featured, more than once, in the kind of regional lifestyle magazine that covers prominent families doing prominent things. But inside that house, something quieter and colder had already begun taking shape, almost from the very first week. Eleanor remembered the day the bedrooms were assigned with unusual clarity. She was 14. Vivian walked her through the east wing of the house with a clipboard, the way someone tours a property they're considering renovating. "This will be yours," Vivian said, opening the door to a small room at the end of the hall. Pleasant enough, but noticeably smaller than the rooms given to Bradley and Caroline, with a single window facing the side garden instead of the main grounds. "Caroline's room is bigger," Eleanor said, not as a complaint, simply as an observation, the way a careful child notices things. "Caroline has more things," Vivian said simply, already walking toward the next item on her list. It wasn't said cruelly. That, Eleanor would learn over the following years, was the precise quality that made Vivian's coldness so difficult to ever point to directly. Nothing she did was ever quite cruel enough to confront. It simply accumulated, year after year, into something that didn't have a name but was unmistakably, permanently felt. The photographs followed the same pattern. At Christmas, the mantelpiece in the main living room filled gradually with framed pictures: Bradley's graduation, Caroline's debutante ball, family vacations to the Cape. Eleanor appeared in group shots, technically present, but rarely in a frame of her own. When a family friend once asked, at a holiday party, who the quiet, dark-haired girl standing slightly apart from the others was, Vivian had answered smoothly, without missing a beat. "That's Eleanor, Harrison's daughter from his first marriage." 3 words that managed to sound like an explanation and an apology at the same time. Eleanor was 16 when she heard that sentence for the first time. She would go on to hear some version of it dozens more times over the years, at dinner parties and fundraisers and family gatherings, always delivered with the same smooth, practiced lightness, as though it were simply a polite biographical detail rather than a quiet, repeated reminder of exactly where she stood. She never corrected Vivian. She never explained, to the family friends who asked, that Harrison was, in fact, simply her father. Not her father from a previous marriage, not a complicated family footnote. Just her father, full stop. She had learned, by then, that correcting Vivian rarely changed anything except the temperature of the room for the rest of the evening. By the time Eleanor reached her mid-20s, the pattern in that house had calcified into something everyone simply accepted as normal. The unspoken architecture of the family, as fixed and unquestioned as the literal architecture of the house itself. Holidays were the worst of it. One particular Thanksgiving, only a few years before Harrison's death, brought the dynamic in a sharper focus than it had ever been before. The table was set beautifully, as it always was, Vivian's doing, down to the last detail. Bradley was telling a long story about a business venture he was certain was about to take off. Caroline, 2 glasses of wine into the evening, was in the particular mood that made her sharper than usual. "It's sweet that Dad still includes you in everything," Caroline said, turning to Eleanor with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, swirling her wine glass idly. "Considering you're not actually his." The table went quiet for half a second. That particular, electric half-second where everyone present knows something has shifted, even before they fully understand what was said. "I am actually his," Eleanor said quietly, evenly, not raising her voice, simply stating a fact. "You know what I mean," Caroline said, waving a hand. "Biologically. It's just funny, that's all. The way Dad treats you like you're his real daughter." Harrison, seated at the head of the table, set down his fork with a small, deliberate click against the china. He didn't raise his voice either. He simply looked at Caroline, his expression calm but unmistakably firm. "She is exactly as much mine as you are," he said. "I'd ask you not to say something like that again." Caroline rolled her eyes, the particular eye roll of someone who has gotten away with similar comments for years and doesn't yet understand the ground has shifted beneath her. "I'm just being honest," she said, but she changed the subject anyway, launching into a story about a friend's renovation project. Vivian smiled tightly across the table and refilled her own wine glass, saying nothing at all, neither defending Eleanor nor correcting her daughter, which was, in its own way, exactly the kind of response Eleanor had come to expect. Bradley said nothing either, which had always been Bradley's particular specialty, a man who had perfected the art of being present for every uncomfortable moment in that family without ever once being responsible for resolving one. Eleanor said nothing more either, but something in her father's face that evening, the quiet certainty in how quickly and clearly he had corrected the room, the way his eyes had found hers afterward, briefly, almost apologetically, as if to say "I see this, even when I can't fix all of it," stayed with her far longer than Caroline's comment itself ever could have. What none of them knew was that Harrison had begun, around that same period, inviting Eleanor on what he called his Saturday rounds. It started simply enough, an invitation to join him on a site visit to an old textile mill he was considering for restoration, framed as nothing more than a father wanting company for a long drive. "You don't have to come," he told her the first time, somewhat awkwardly, the way fathers sometimes are with adult daughters they love deeply but have never quite learned how to talk to directly. "I just thought you might find it interesting." She came, and she kept coming, almost every Saturday, for 6 years. Vivian assumed these outings were sentimental, a father indulging a daughter who didn't have much else going on in her life, in Vivian's estimation. She mentioned this once, lightly, at a dinner party, in front of several guests, including a business associate of Harrison's who had asked, politely, what Eleanor did for a living. "Oh, Eleanor humors him," Vivian said, laughing, swirling her own wine glass in the particular way she had. "He drags her around to all these old buildings on the weekends. It's very sweet, honestly. Keeps him company. It was not humoring. For 6 years, on those Saturday rounds, Harrison was quietly, deliberately teaching his daughter everything he knew about the business he had spent his entire adult life building. How to read a property's structural bones beneath decades of neglect. How preservation trusts were legally constructed, and why they mattered far more than ordinary property deeds. How to evaluate a building's true long-term value versus its surface appeal. A skill, he told her once, standing in the gutted shell of an old courthouse, that applied to people just as much as buildings. Most people only see what's falling apart, he said that day, running a hand along a water-damaged support beam that would, 18 months later, anchor a fully restored county archive. They never stopped to ask what's actually holding the structure together underneath. Eleanor absorbed every bit of it, not because she suspected anything about an inheritance, not because she had any strategic sense of where this was leading, but because she genuinely loved the work, and because those Saturdays were the only hours of her week where she felt completely, unambiguously seen by another person. She eventually pursued formal certification, studying historic preservation law and architectural conservation at night. Around a full-time administrative job, she'd taken largely to have some independence from the family. She became a licensed architectural preservationist in her own right, quietly, without announcement, without anyone in the family asking a single question about what she actually did for a living. Bradley assumed she had some vague office job, the kind of thing he never thought to ask follow-up questions about. Caroline referred to her work, when she referred to it at all, as Eleanor's little hobby, usually in the same breath as a comment about her own far more glamorous involvement with the charity gala committee. Neither of them ever asked what the hobby actually was. Neither of them ever asked to see a single project she'd worked on, despite the fact that several of those projects had, by then, been featured in regional architecture publications. Harrison knew exactly what it was. He had been there for every certification exam, every site visit, every late evening she spent studying at his kitchen table while Vivian and her children were out at galas Eleanor was never quite invited to, or invited to in the particular half-hearted way that made attending feel worse than staying home. "You're better at this than I was at your age," Harrison told her once, reviewing a structural assessment she'd completed independently on a federal-style townhouse the company was considering. He wasn't a man who handed out compliments freely. Eleanor remembered that sentence for years afterward, turning it over the way she turned over very few other things anyone in that family had ever said to her. Harrison Whitfield died on a quiet Tuesday morning in early spring, of a heart condition the family hadn't fully realized was as serious as it was. He had complained, for months, of fatigue that everyone, including his doctors, had attributed to age and overwork. By the time the underlying condition was properly diagnosed, there was very little time left. Eleanor was the one who drove him to his final cardiology appointment, 3 weeks before he died. Vivian had a luncheon. Bradley had a meeting he described as unmissable. Caroline had a fitting for a dress. Eleanor sat with her father in the waiting room, and then in the small examination room afterward, while the cardiologist explained, gently but clearly, what was likely coming. Harrison listened without much visible reaction. Then he turned to Eleanor. "I need you to do something for me," he said quietly, once the doctor had stepped out. "I need you to trust that whatever I've put in place, I put in place very carefully, even if it doesn't make sense to anyone else for a while." Eleanor didn't fully understand what he meant. She simply nodded, took his hand, and told him she trusted him completely, the way she always had. The funeral was large, formal, exactly the kind of event Vivian had always been skilled at orchestrating. White lilies, a string quartet, a guest list that read like a who's who of the regional business community. Eleanor stood slightly apart from the rest of the family during the service, the way she had learned, over 15 years, to stand slightly apart from almost everything involving them. Not out of resentment, simply out of habit, the quiet muscle memory of a person who had long ago stopped expecting to be pulled into the center of things. 3 days after the funeral, before the will had even been formally read, Caroline approached Eleanor in the kitchen of the family estate, where Eleanor was quietly making tea, largely to have something to do with her hands. "I think it might be time for you to start thinking about your own place," Caroline said, leaning against the counter, not unkindly, in the particular tone people use when they believe themselves to be being practical rather than cruel. I mean, now that Dad's gone, there's really no reason for you to keep staying here. Eleanor looked at her for a long moment, the kettle beginning to hum quietly behind her. You're right, she said simply. There isn't. Caroline took this as agreement and softened slightly, relieved the conversation hadn't been more difficult. I just think it's healthier, she added, almost gently. For everyone. A fresh start. Eleanor poured her tea and said nothing further. It was not agreement Caroline had received. It was something closer to relief. The quiet relief of a woman who finally understood, completely, exactly where she stood with people who had spent 15 years making that position perfectly clear and who no longer needed to wonder about it at all. The will reading took place 2 weeks later, in the office of Mr. Castellano, the family's longtime estate attorney, a careful, soft-spoken man who had represented Harrison for nearly 30 years and had, in that time, come to know the family dynamics with the particular clarity of someone who has watched a great deal and said very little. Vivian arrived dressed, as she always did for occasions she considered important, like a woman attending her own coronation, a tailored black suit, pearls, hair freshly styled. Bradley arrived a few minutes late, already discussing, with a friend on the phone in the hallway outside, a yacht he had apparently begun negotiating to purchase. Caroline arrived with a slim folder of real estate listings tucked under her arm, for houses she had already begun touring in a far wealthier part of town, the kind of neighborhood she had always felt she deserved. Eleanor arrived quietly, on time, and sat near the back of the room, saying almost nothing to anyone. Mr. Castellano began reading through the standard provisions. Modest gifts to longtime household staff who had served the family for years. A meaningful donation to a historic preservation foundation Harrison had supported throughout his career. And then, finally, the central provisions of the estate, the part of the reading the entire family had been waiting for. The family home, the historic preservation company Harrison had built over 4 decades, and the bulk of the property portfolio, easily worth tens of millions of dollars, were addressed in a single clause that made Vivian sit forward in her chair with quiet, confident anticipation, the posture of a woman expecting to hear her own name. But the clause did not name an heir outright. Instead, it stated that the primary estate would transfer to whichever beneficiary could demonstrate, through documented and verifiable means, a genuine and sustained understanding of what the house actually is. The room went still. Vivian blinked, her smile faltering slightly. I'm sorry, she said. What does that mean? Mr. Castellano adjusted his glasses, his expression giving away nothing. It means precisely what it says. Mr. Whitfield structured this provision deliberately. The estate does not transfer by name. It transfers by qualification. Vivian laughed, a short, confused, slightly nervous laugh that didn't quite land the way she wanted it to. That's absurd. We're his family. Of course it transfers by name. Mr. Whitfield was very specific, Castellano said gently, closing the folder in front of him. I'd advise patience while the qualifying review is conducted. Vivian did not have patience. Few people who have spent a lifetime assuming things were owed to them ever do. Now, this is where I want you to pay close attention. Because what Vivian, Bradley, and Caroline did next, in the weeks following that confusing, unresolved will reading, is exactly the kind of mistake that turns an inheritance dispute into something far more costly than any of them could have imagined sitting in that office. They assumed the clause was a formality, a strange but ultimately meaningless legal hurdle their family lawyer would clear within days. They assumed, because they had always assumed, that the outcome was already decided in their favor, the way it had always, eventually, gone their way before. Let me show you exactly how that played out. Bradley met his friend Patrick for drinks 2 days after the will reading. They sat at a polished bar overlooking the harbor, the same harbor where the yacht he had his eye on was currently docked. So you're really doing this? Patrick asked, watching Bradley scroll through photos of the boat on his phone. Why wouldn't I? Bradley said, signaling the bartender for another round. The estate's worth what, 40, 50 million? My share alone covers this 10 times over. Didn't your lawyer say there's some weird clause? Bradley waved a hand. Some legal formality. Castellano's just being thorough, that's all he does. It'll clear in a few weeks. He smiled, already imagining himself on the deck. I'm not waiting around for paperwork to catch up to what everyone already knows is happening. He put down the deposit the following Monday. $40,000, non-refundable, against a balance of nearly $2 million due in 11 weeks. Caroline's conversation happened over coffee with a real estate agent named Felicia in the sunlit kitchen of a stately colonial in the city's most coveted neighborhood, the kind of house Caroline had been quietly coveting for years, ever since a former college roommate had purchased something similar. It's a competitive market right now, Felicia said carefully. If you want to be serious about this house, I'd recommend moving quickly. There's another offer coming in by Friday. Caroline didn't hesitate. Put in the offer. Full asking, no contingencies. No contingencies? Felicia raised an eyebrow. Even on financing? My father just passed, Caroline said, the practiced solemnity in her voice not quite masking the confidence underneath it. There's a significant inheritance coming. I won't need financing contingencies. She signed the offer that afternoon. Her bid was accepted within 2 days. She placed a substantial deposit, and within the week, had already begun selecting furniture for rooms she hadn't legally purchased yet, working with a designer who specialized in exactly the kind of refined, old-money aesthetic Caroline had always felt she was entitled to and had simply been waiting for the right house to display it in. Vivian's version of this same mistake was, in its own way, the most telling of all three. She didn't wait for the estate to clear before acting. She called a decorator the very week after the will reading, a well-known name in the city's design circles, someone she had been wanting to work with for years but had never quite had the unrestricted budget to justify. I want the main house completely refreshed, Vivian told the decorator, walking her through the grand foyer, the formal living room, the dining room where that uncomfortable Thanksgiving dinner had taken place years earlier. New furniture throughout. I wanted to feel like the next chapter, something that's finally, truly mine. And the budget? The decorator asked. Whatever it takes, Vivian said, with the easy confidence of a woman who had simply never imagined the house might not, in the end, belong to her at all. This is going to be my home for the rest of my life. I wanted to finally reflect that. She authorized an initial design deposit of nearly $200,000 that same week, paid against funds she had pulled forward from a line of credit, secured, implicitly, against an inheritance that existed, at that point, only in her own certainty. Meanwhile, Eleanor did something none of them thought to do. She asked Mr. Castellano for a private meeting. What did he mean? Eleanor asked, sitting across from him in his office a few days after the reading. By what the house actually is. Castellano studied her for a long moment, the particular look of a man deciding how much he was permitted to say. Then he opened a drawer and slid a thick folder across the desk. Your father, he said, structured this estate inside what's called a qualified preservation trust. It's an unusual instrument. I've used it perhaps twice in 30 years of practice. It only transfers to a beneficiary who holds a verifiable, documented background in historic preservation. Licensure, project history, demonstrated involvement in the underlying business over a meaningful period of time. It was designed, very deliberately, so that the estate could not simply pass to whoever shouted the loudest in that room, or whoever assumed the most confidently. Eleanor sat with that for a long moment, her hands very still in her lap. He built this for me, she said quietly. It wasn't quite a question. He built this, Castellano said, for whoever actually understood what he spent his life building. He simply suspected, quite strongly, based on conversations we had over several years, that only one person in this family ever would. For the first time since her father's death, Eleanor allowed herself to cry, sitting in that quiet office. Not from sadness, though there was certainly sadness in it. From something closer to being finally, completely understood by someone who was no longer there to say it out loud himself. A feeling that arrives, sometimes, with more force than grief itself. Over the following weeks, Eleanor quietly compiled exactly what the trust required. Her preservation license, earned years earlier without a single family member asking about it. Years of project documentation from sites she had worked alongside her father, structural assessments, restoration plans, correspondence in which Harrison had formally listed her, in writing, as a junior associate of the company. Records of every Saturday round, every site visit log, 6 years of quiet, consistent, deeply unglamorous work that had never once been performed for an audience, because there had never been one. It was not playing pretend, as Caroline had always characterized it. It was a 6-year apprenticeship, documented in meticulous legal detail, conducted entirely in plain sight, by a man who had been very deliberately building a case his family would never see coming, because they had never once thought to look. While Eleanor compiled her documentation quietly, the rest of the family's spending accelerated, each decision compounding on the last. Bradley closed on the yacht in full just under a month after the will reading, confident the inheritance would arrive before the next quarterly payment came due. He took friends out for a celebratory weekend on the water, posted photographs online with captions about new beginnings, and told anyone who asked that the family business was simply sorting out some paperwork before everything formally transferred. Caroline's house closing proceeded smoothly through the early stages, the deposits for furniture growing larger by the week. A custom dining table, a set of antique mirrors, drapery commissioned from a workshop in Charleston. She had already begun planning a housewarming gathering, mentally drafting a guest list designed, in no small part, to be seen by exactly the right people in exactly the right house. Vivian's renovation proceeded at the fastest pace of all. Within 6 weeks, the main estate house was half stripped of its original furnishings, awaiting a complete refresh that had already cost more than the entire household's annual operating budget under Harrison. Every single decision they made in those weeks was built on a future that had not yet been confirmed. And every single one of those decisions would, within a matter of months, come due against an inheritance that was never coming to them at all. The second legal meeting took place 2 months after the will reading. Eleanor arrived with a thick folder of her own documentation, organized with the same careful precision she brought to every restoration project. Vivian arrived expecting a formality, dressed once again as though attending a celebration. Bradley and Caroline arrived discussing renovation plans and furniture deliveries, openly, in the hallway outside Castellano's office, within earshot of Eleanor, who said nothing. Mr. Castellano reviewed Eleanor's documentation carefully, methodically, in complete silence for nearly 20 minutes while the rest of the family grew visibly impatient, Bradley checking his phone twice, Caroline glancing at her watch. Finally, he looked up. Eleanor Whitfield meets every qualification outlined in the trust, he said. She is, as of this review, the sole verified beneficiary of the primary estate. The room went completely silent. Then Vivian laughed, the same short, nervous laugh from the first meeting, except now there was real fear underneath it, barely concealed. That's not possible. She doesn't even work in the company. Not really. She humors Harrison on the weekends. That's all it ever was. She's been a licensed architectural preservationist for 4 years, Castellano said, his tone even and unhurried. She holds documented project history on 12 of your husband's restoration sites, dating back 6 years. She was listed, by your husband's own hand, as a junior associate in the company as of 3 years ago. This is not a casual hobby, Mrs. Whitfield. This is a verified professional record. Vivian stared at him, something collapsing visibly behind her eyes.
He never told me that.
He told no one. That appears to have been entirely deliberate.
Bradley sat forward, his face pale. So what does that mean for us? For the house? 4. It means, Castellano said, that under the terms of this trust, the primary estate, the company, and the associated property portfolio transfer in full to Eleanor. The collapse that followed happened with the particular speed that only comes when an entire family has spent months spending money they never actually had. Bradley's yacht payment came due 11 days later. With no inheritance to cover it, the deal collapsed publicly and humiliatingly. The boat repossessed, his deposit forfeited entirely, with a small, uncomfortable mention in a regional boating publication that several of his friends happened to see, accompanied by exactly the kind of speculation he had hoped to avoid. Caroline's house purchase, similarly leveraged against funds that were never coming, fell through during final underwriting, when the bank, reviewing her financial position more closely, discovered there was no inheritance to substantiate the contingency-free offer she had made. The deposits she'd placed on furniture, custom-ordered and already in production, were entirely non-refundable. She lost both the house and a considerable amount of money she didn't have to lose. The housewarming guest list she'd so carefully drafted never sent at all. And Vivian's situation was the most serious of all. because what none of them had read closely enough, in their rush to assume the outcome, was a secondary clause buried deeper in the will. Harrison had left Vivian a life interest in the family estate house, the right to remain there for the rest of her life. But that interest was explicitly conditioned on respectful conduct toward Eleanor. A clause, Castellano later confirmed quietly, that Harrison had added only 18 months before his death, not long after a particular Thanksgiving dinner he never forgot. Eleanor's documentation, the same file she'd compiled to claim her inheritance, also, unavoidably, included records of how she had been treated. Years of correspondence. The comment Caroline made in the kitchen 3 days after the funeral, which Eleanor had, almost instinctively, written down later that evening. The way she had quietly written down so many things over the years, never imagining it would ever matter legally. The pattern of exclusion from family photographs. The repeated description of her, to guests, as Harrison's daughter from his first marriage, rather than simply his daughter. It mattered enormously. The life interest was forfeited. Vivian did not just lose her expected inheritance. She lost the house she was already living in, the half-renovated foyer still draped in fabric swatches and paint samples she would never get to choose between. She left the estate 4 months after her husband's death, moving into a modest condominium her own children, now also financially strained, could only help with modestly. The family that had once orchestrated seamless holiday photographs and elegant dinner parties now rarely spoke to one another at all, each one quietly aware of exactly how much of their own downfall had been built, brick, by their own hands and their own assumptions. As for Eleanor, she did not throw a celebration. She did not gloat, did not post anything, did not seek out a single confrontation with Vivian, Bradley, or Caroline after the final ruling. She simply did what her father had spent 6 years quietly teaching her to do. She went back to work. She took over Whitfield Preservation Group with the same quiet, careful attention her father had always shown the company. She didn't change the name. She didn't make dramatic public statements about her stepfamily. She simply continued the work, restoring old buildings other people had written off, finding value where others had stopped looking, exactly the way her father had taught her, on all those Saturdays nobody else had ever bothered to ask about. About a year later, a journalist writing a feature on the company's latest restoration project, a beautifully revived 19th-century train depot, now serving as a community arts center, asked Eleanor, almost as an afterthought, what it had been like growing up in such a prominent family. Eleanor considered the question for a long moment, looking out at the depot's restored clock tower through the window of her office. I think, she said finally, that for a long time, I believed being overlooked meant being unworthy. It took me years to understand that the person who actually mattered most was paying very close attention the entire time. He just never made a show of it. He simply made sure that when the truth finally arrived, it would speak more clearly than any argument I could have made myself. There are a few things I want you to take from this story today. The first is something I think too many women have been taught to doubt about themselves. Being overlooked by people who don't value you is not the same as being unworthy. Sometimes the people who matter most are watching quietly, from somewhere you don't expect, taking note of exactly who you are when no one is performing for an audience. The years Eleanor spent feeling invisible in that house were not wasted years. They were the years her father spent learning, with absolute certainty, exactly who deserved to inherit what he'd built. The second lesson is about patience, and about the particular danger of building your future on an assumption rather than a fact. Bradley, Caroline, and Vivian didn't lose everything because the universe punished them poetically. They lost everything because they spent money, made promises, and built entire futures against an inheritance they never confirmed, never investigated, and never genuinely earned. Before you spend your confidence, your money, or your certainty on an outcome you believe is coming, make sure you've actually done the work to confirm it's real. A yacht deposit, a house offer, a renovation budget. None of it asked a single honest question before the money moved. The third lesson is the one I most want to leave you with today. Cruelty has a cost, even when it takes years to come due. Vivian and her children spent 15 years treating Eleanor as someone who didn't quite belong. Through small comments at dinner tables, through bedrooms assigned by size rather than love, through photographs that never quite included her. They never imagined that the quiet, overlooked stepdaughter in the corner of every family photograph was the one person actually paying close enough attention to inherit everything that mattered. Not because she schemed for it, not because she sought revenge, but because she was simply the only one in that family who ever showed up, consistently, with genuine respect, for a man who deserved far more of it than he ever received from the people who were supposed to love him unconditionally. In the end, Eleanor Whitfield didn't win because a will favored her. She won because, for 6 quiet years, she chose to show up. She chose curiosity over resentment, patience over proving a point, and quiet competence over public validation. And when the truth of who she really was finally arrived, it didn't need her to say a single word in her own defense. The people who dismissed her had 15 years to truly know her. They chose, instead, to assume. And assumptions, as this family learned far too late, are the most expensive thing a person can ever choose to believe. If you know someone who needs to hear this story today, share it with them. And if this is the first time you've found our channel, welcome. Hit that subscribe button and stay with us, because there are more stories like this one, and every single one of them has something worth learning.